Until the late 1960s, the medical community believed that autism was caused by bad mothering. Today, most people and most of the medical community believes that autism is a genetic brain disorder. I'm here to tell you that neither one of these statements is true. We must ask ourselves, why do 95 to 100% of autistic children have gastrointestinal dysfunction, or 70% of them have immune system abnormalities? Experts who have studied autism spectrum disorders and work with autistic patients have seen time after time that these patients suffer from allergies, toxic exposures, infections, and nutritional deficiencies. But where do problems like these come from, and how do they affect the brain? And are they in the brain to begin with? It has long been known that children with autism not only have misfiring and wiring of their brain, but that 95% of autistic children have gastrointestinal problems and swollen bellies. It has also been noted that autistic children have frequent infections and allergies and have often had multiple courses of antibiotics.
Autism has been misunderstood. I think a basic way to think about the mechanism by which the gut is impacting the brain in autism is that when there is gut inflammation, it impacts the integrity of the intestinal lining, and so things enter into the systemic circulation that stimulate inflammation and inflammation in the brain as well. And we know that there's microglial activation. We know that there's a degree of
In other words, the brains of autistic kids are inflamed.
Right.
These gut, immune, and toxicity problems are integrally related to and often the cause of what happens in the brain. The brain and body function as a whole system, and multiple chronic triggers can throw the brain into chaos. So is autism a brain disorder or a systemic disorder that affects the brain?
With autism, I think we look at it as a neurologic or a brain disorder. And for me, autism is a brain disorder that happens downstream from several other medical problems. Kids with autism often have immune problems, they have gut problems, they have metabolic problems, and those are being missed because we say this child has autism. But if we look at the underlying mineral deficiencies or their dietary problems or their gut problems, we can actually help them to be not just more available for their therapy, but possibly recover. So if we treat the body, we can help the brain to get better.
When we look at the idea that people, automatically think that something, and especially autism, is genetic. Most people don't really understand what that means, and I think they get it wrong in the media a lot. There isn't actually physical damage to genes, but rather segments of genes are turned off and inhibited, usually by different chemicals or molecules in our body, methyl molecules in particular, that basically cover up and prevent that from being read. 85% of our genes are actually there to build our brain. So the genes that are most commonly affected are the ones that actually have to do with brain development. The good news is because they're environmental factors that in the womb and even after the child is born and even into adulthood, we can modify gene expression, or at least we're pretty sure we can, so that it's never over. It's never too late, but it's also never too early.
I've had many, many patients with autism. One comes to mind who was a little boy, 2 or 3 years old, who was quite dramatically affected. He had regressive autism. He had a number of insults, antibiotics, infections, vaccines. All these things affected his capacity to actually develop normally. And his parents were told by the doctors, and by the way, his mother worked for a large pharma company, but they were told, you need occupational therapy, you need behavioral therapy, good luck, he'll probably end up in an institution, and we're sorry. And that message, unfortunately, is something that parents get all the time, and it makes me angry because I know there's so much we can do, because autism is not a brain disorder. It's a disorder that affects the brain. We now see dramatic amounts of inflammation in these children. We see exposure to toxins. We see all these gut dysfunctions in these kids, and dysbiosis, we call it, imbalances in the gut flora. All these things drive brain dysfunction. So by fixing those things, often the brain will recover. So I see this one young boy came in and he had terrible gut issues. They all had stinky, smelly stools, gas, diarrhea, horrible bowel movements. He had severe nutritional deficiencies, B vitamins, folate, B6, B12. He had mercury in his body. And we were able to fix all these things one at a time. And he recovered. He went from, not being able to speak to being fluent, from being in autistic class to being a normal kid in mainstream school. And now he's about 10 years old and he's completely normal, completely lost his diagnosis, happy, normal, well-adjusted kid, not even on the spectrum at all. If inflammation starts in the belly, and so many autistic children have swollen bellies, then it spreads to the brain. And it can literally lead to a swollen brain, and the effects can be disastrous. The take-home message here is that the answer to autism and other neurodevelopment disorders will not be found in one of these factors, but in all of them taken together in varying degrees in each individual. Rather than studying drugs that affect the brain to treat autism, the better path may be to studying treatments that target inflammation and toxins and allergens and microbes and infections, or fixing biochemical train wrecks like the problems with methylation and sulfation, as well as gut problems and mitochondrial dysfunction. Dr. Go, you've been looking at the world through a different lens since you saw this patient, Jake. And tell us how he changed your thinking about autism and how the body responds to various insults.
Sure. So this young boy was 8 years old when I met him. And I met him at the time I was co-director of the autism program at Columbia University. And I remember being so moved by him and his mother because of how much they had done along their journey with autism. So he was first diagnosed young, around 18 months, and had received a lot of very important therapies like behavior intervention and speech-language therapy. But it wasn't until he started to receive mitochondrial therapy at the age of 3.5 that things really started to change. So at that time, he wasn't speaking, he had difficulty walking, he wasn't able to run. His mother took him to Johns Hopkins University to have additional testing, and mainly metabolic and mitochondrial testing. And it was there that a diagnosis of mitochondrial dysfunction with autism was made, and he was started on a series of vitamins and supplements that over the course of weeks and months radically changed his developmental trajectory. So he began to speak, began to interact socially, his gross motor and fine motor skills improved dramatically. And so he continued those therapies up until when I met him, which was at age 8. And at that point, he had been doing well, he was mainstreamed in school, but he was beginning to refuse to take the large quantity of vitamins and supplements. And so he'd been inconsistent with that, and he was having a period of regression. So his symptoms were worsening. So he'd made dramatic progress, and now he was struggling again. He was struggling in social interaction, high levels of anxiety, headaches, daily migraine headaches, and obsessive compulsive behaviors. So severe that he had trouble walking down a sidewalk because he was retracing his steps. It was hard to get out of the house in the morning. And so this was, of course, alarming to his parents. And with resuming mitochondrial therapy through L-carnitine, coenzyme Q10, B vitamins, some very basic supplements, he began to improve again. And now he's a thriving junior high school student, plays competitive travel soccer, is in a mainstream school, and is doing incredibly well.
It's an extraordinary story. And yet when you go to the doctor, most of the time they don't know how to diagnose mitochondrial dysfunction and probably never heard of mitochondrial therapy.
That's right.
Tell us about your work in mitochondrial discovery of how this is connected to autism. Because mitochondria is the place where we make energy. And it seems like a lot of his symptoms were energy deficit.
Yes. He had very low tone, fatigue, delayed milestones, all of which are associated with mitochondrial impairment.
What are mitochondria anyway?
So mitochondria, if you think about the cells of the body, nearly all the cells of the body have inside of them mitochondria. And mitochondria are they're classified as a subcellular organelle, so they're tiny structures inside of cells.
Like a cell within a cell.
Yes. And a cell can have dozens or up to thousands of mitochondria. And mitochondria are sometimes called the powerhouse of the cell because one of their main functions is to generate energy. And they do that in the form of ATP, which is thought of as the currency or the fuel, the energy currency for the body. So mitochondria are a powerhouse. They do a lot of other things. It's interesting that they're called the powerhouse because, in fact, they're actually very delicate structures, and they're very sensitive to environmental factors, stress, toxins, oxidative stress.
They're easily damaged.
They're easily damaged, but they're so important for all of the body's functions. And the brain is particularly dependent on the function of mitochondria because it has such a high energy demand. So the developing brain is hugely impacted by mitochondrial function.
It's like you run out of gas, right? Your brain doesn't work, and so the brain doesn't have a lot of ways of responding to insults, and you lose mitochondria, you get all sorts of problems, whether it's Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autism, and as you said, the mitochondria are really sensitive to insults. So what have you found are the worst offenders in damaging the mitochondria?
There's a term that's sometimes used called secondary mitochondrial dysfunction, meaning not due to a genetic cause, but due to other factors like inflammation, physiological stressors, medications. So there are some medications that are known to be toxic to mitochondria.
Like statins.
Yes, yes. Very widely used medications. Some antibiotics, some commonly used psychiatric medications that are commonly used in children, in young children with autism, like risperidone.
That's an antipsychotic.
Yes, and it's very, very widely used in the treatment of autism. Mitochondria can be impacted by so many different factors. Many chemicals and industrial chemicals and pesticides that are widely used that we know clearly have toxicity to the developing brain. Many of those chemicals impact the function of mitochondria.
What are the kinds of foods that actually hurt the mitochondria, and what are those that help the mitochondria?
So we think that the foods that are helpful to the mitochondria are foods that are rich in antioxidants, that have our natural source of, for example, B vitamins. There are foods that are natural sources of coenzyme Q10. Coenzyme Q10 is key in one aspect of the mitochondria called the respiratory chain that is directly involved in the generation of ATP.
So what would that be that has CoQ10 in it?
A lot of foods that we may not want to be. So liver. Liver has
liver's good. Liver's got B vitamins. Liver's a mitochondrial food.
Yes.
Yeah.
Carnitine, for example, which is in high concentration in meat products.
Yeah, particularly lamb.
First and foremost, diet. The gut is not the second brain, I think it's the first brain. So if we're not giving our kids a good anti-inflammatory, whole foods, non-processed diet, we're not doing the right thing by them. Then we look at what supplements, what minerals, what vitamins they may be needing, and we do that. Then we look at other illnesses like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, NMDA encephalitis, and see what we can learn from those diseases and what medications or supplements help those people that may also help our kids with autism. And then we also look at homeopathy, intuitive therapy, and other therapies that may help them in general. One of those may be hyperbaric oxygen. We don't use it in every kid, but in children with inflammation, with Lyme disease, with cerebral palsy, with traumatic brain injury and concussions, it may be an adjunct to the other therapies that we use. Hyperbaric oxygen is where you give oxygen at a higher percentage. What we're breathing is 21% oxygen. And so depending on the unit, you can give anywhere from concentrated oxygen, which is like 28 to 35%, to up to 100% oxygen. But more importantly, you give it at an increased pressure. So you help that oxygen to get into the cells and decrease the inflammation and also improve the mitochondrial function, because that's something else that's affected in a lot of our kids. The mitochondria are the energy cells of all of our body. And so when our energy cells are not working, our energy is dysregulated. That doesn't mean we may be lethargic. We may be, like with chronic fatigue, but we may also be revved, like we see in our kids with autism. It's sort of like that car idling that the engine revs without us pressing on the gas. That's what our kids with autism are like, and HBOT can also help that.
Treating the gut and giving B12, B6, and folate, giving omega-3 fats and vitamin D and vitamin A and magnesium and zinc, eliminating gluten and casein from the diet, detoxifying mercury and lead from their little bodies may be the best way to get autistic children's brain connections working again.
So I think, at the most basic level, I look at omega-3s, vitamin D, probiotics, and then, also along with vitamin D, we usually recommend vitamin A and vitamin K to go along with that. And then, I like to look really individually at the individual person and see what they need.
Attention deficit disorder, known as ADD, today also referred to as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is not a Ritalin deficiency. Yet the use of these drugs is skyrocketing. 1 in 10 American kids are on stimulant medication. In fact, the global use of ADHD medication rose 300% from 1993 to 2000.
Kids who are growing up now with ADD or who take ADD medication to feel comfortable achieving their goals, I would say that you have to trust me. I was there, and there is a better way. If you think that Adderall is the only way you can think clearly right now, you're dead wrong. Because once you adopt the right lifestyle changes, you will be miles and miles ahead of where you are right now.
Since when did this become a normal consequence of being a child? Back in the day, it wasn't that long ago, we had maybe one troubled kid in the classroom. How do we go from that to 1 in 10 kids with ADHD today? The real question becomes what causes ADHD and why is it so prevalent? ADHD is just a name that we give to people who share a collection of symptoms. They can't focus or pay attention, they're inattentive, and they're hyperactive. These are symptoms. What are the causes? Well, it could be many things. Nutritional deficiencies, bacterial intestinal overgrowth, detox imbalances, leaky gut, or chronic inflammation.
It's important for all of us, and especially for our children, to really be watching, keeping the junk food away. Junk food's also high in additives and food coloring. And there's been multiple studies to show that these food colorings and additives can have an impact on our children's attention and focus. And we can see good improvements in kids' attention and focus when we take them off of these processed foods and foods that have food coloring adding to them. Some of the most important things for improving your children's diet is first of all, just having good, healthy food available. We know that when there's good, healthy food around, kids will choose healthy food. So you want to get the junk food, get the processed food out of the house, and have healthy food around. Have vegetables cut up so kids can snack on them. Have fruit available. In addition, get your children involved in cooking and get your children involved in the food that you provide for the family.
Well, I always encourage parents, and this is kind of how I think a lot of us were raised way back when, but what's provided is provided. The parents decide what's going to be eaten and when it's going to be provided, and then you leave it up to the children to decide whether they're going to eat it. It's a little bit uncomfortable because none of us want our children to go hungry, but very few children will do that. And I think it's really important to have children exposed to food and new foods and let them, try things or not try things and just get comfortable that it takes a little time for them to adapt to, new foods or new ways of eating. I really try to focus too on what to eat. For these children, it's critical. A lot of them need support with their detoxification system. So getting in vegetables and kind of any way we can and into smoothies and juices, green juices, things like that can be really, really supportive for their detoxification system. And good quality fats. Pretty much all of our children get on a good quality fish oil. Very few of them are eating fish. We find their omega-3 fatty acids to be very low. And we were talking before about the developmental brain. These children, their brains are developing and they need those building blocks. So getting like a good quality fish oil and some of the oils that you get from some of the seeds and things are really important too. So that I would kind of put at top of the list of something to focus on, what to give your child who might be dealing with some of the cognitive issues.
If you or your child or someone you know and love is dealing with ADHD, there are things you can do starting today to minimize your symptoms and get back to your life.
It's so important for parents to understand that the child is never broken, that you can change these things at almost any stage. And not only change them, but most of the kids that I work with are really gifted. And they're so gifted in certain areas of their brain, that certain areas of the brain are so strong, certain networks are so good relative to other people, that they're more susceptible to an imbalance. Because if the environment doesn't properly stimulate the growth and development during one stage of development, then they're more likely to develop an imbalance because they're so good in certain areas. So, never give up on the child. And there's always hope. And, we see it all the time. And I think people really need to just educate themselves and stay away from anybody that tells you, there's nothing you can do, just accept it, just be happy with the small stuff. Anybody that's saying that to you, just run away from them as fast as you can and really, educate yourself. I think my books are a really good source of where to start off, because it gives them a different perspective on what actually is out there. But exercises, diet, nutrition, there are so many great people doing so many great innovative things that I think they can really see things that will change their life and really get their children to be who they always knew they would be. I think that's kind of the greatest thing when parents come up to me and say, you really gave us the child that we always knew was there, that couldn't get out. And now here he is, or here she is. And, usually, of course, they're crying and I'm crying at that point. But, to me, there's nothing more important. There's nothing more important than being able to help a child that's struggling, to be able to help a family, and to be able to restore their hopes and dreams. And that's really, my main message is never give up and, always keep hope, and you'll find the answers.
Also, in current day society, we're dealing with a lot of social media, and, little kids now are playing video games instead of back in the day where they used to go out and play football and be interactive. And so again, there's a lot more of that isolation, and that whatever channel, whatever video game they're on, that's also affecting their relationships and their mental health. Instead of having your child be sticking an iPad in front of them so that you don't have to worry about, calming them down. But are you going to stick that iPad for 5 hours in front of them and get them hooked on to that game? Or are you going to limit something where it's more educational and have them, be there for half an hour, learn something actually, and then actually bring them to the dinner table without the iPad and say, okay, let's have a family dinner. Let's communicate where we have the emotional warmth instead of this, cold iPad in front of us.
I had a daughter who was clearly a little different. An autism diagnosis, the subset of which was PDD-NOS. And we got into the system, and the system is designed by and large to manage behaviors. And so we got into the psychopharmacological arena. She must have done 15 or 20 major medications over a couple of year period. Anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, you get on the list. We tried just about everything to try to get some of these things to work for her so that she could at least calm herself down to the point where she could have a meaningful interaction with the world. And I said, okay, but this road of pharmacology here clearly is not happening for us. The side effects are too profound, weight gains and lethargy and excessive sleep, and just to get on the list. Mostly it was that vacantness that distressed me so much and distressed my wife. So a friend told us about this thing called neurofeedback. What's that? Oh, it's just that they put these things on your head, it trains the brain. Okay, well, sure, we'll try it. We were trying anything. Through this process of neurofeedback, we got her to the point where we could get her off all of her medications. One of our symptoms that we look for in clients who come to us, we ask them about their handwriting. People go, what are you asking me about my handwriting for? It is remarkable across ADD, autism spectrum disorder, any number of conditions, handwriting is a huge marker. My daughter's handwriting was indecipherable. It had this really strange pattern, big letters, little letters. It was crazy. She now has the best handwriting in our family. It's almost calligraphic. It's so gorgeous. So point is that she started to gain function over her body, over her emotions, over her socialization, her interactions with others, but be it family or friends, that increase in her ability to interact with strangers, which is always a challenge in the spectrum disorder children, all started to improve. So we're like, this is magical. And I agreed and said, yes, it is magical, and this is something I want to be a part of.
Multiple children, a very high percentage of kids on the autistic spectrum have antibodies against these folate receptors. Folate receptors are in your brain, and you need folate, which comes from your foliage, all your green leafy vegetables. You need folate to bind to these receptors for proper brain development to occur. And unfortunately, a lot of children with these folate receptor antibodies are having changes or decrease in brain development. When we check for folate receptor antibodies, we see a high percentage of children on the autistic spectrum with these antibodies. There are ways that we can treat that. We can treat that by giving higher doses of folate and also by removing dairy from their diet, because dairy often will cause these folate receptor antibodies to occur. Sleep is absolutely underrated, especially in our current culture. Sleep is critical for brain health. Sleep deficiency has been seen time and time again within multiple studies to be linked with decreased cognition, lower mood disorders, having a harder time with memory and focus and attention. Sleep is really critical for our brain, and we need to focus on it all the time. As our children, as all of us are using more and more technology, unfortunately, that often leads to less and less sleep and a lot of issues in terms of attention and focus and ADHD and memory problems.
We've seen a revolution in brain science in the last 20 years. We went from believing that the brain was fixed, that you had a certain number of brain cells at birth. If you damaged them, that was your tough luck, to now understanding that even at the moment of death, you are creating new brain cells and you are creating new connections at any age. And this revolutionized our view of what the brain is capable of. We know that these brain disorders are not fixed. This is one of the most powerful discoveries of the last 20 years, is that we can actually modify these, what we thought were fixed brain disorders like depression and autism and ADD, and even things like dementia and Parkinson's. The body has the capacity to repair, the brain has the capacity to repair and heal when the insults are taken away and the right ingredients are put in the system. Up next, we'll talk about what many believe to be the leading cause of disability in America, depression. We'll also discuss anxiety, fears, and ways to optimize your brain health. See you there.